Hello, Anthony. It's wonderful to have you with me today and having this conversation. I'm a big admirer of your work, your writing, and so thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'll say it's mutual.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to begin with a question. I mean, it was my understanding that the first nation state in history, and I've always said that, maybe wrongly, was Spain, which in 1492 established, tried to unify all the provinces, and create a sort of a unity of faith. And previously, they had established the concept of limpieza de sangre, the purity of blood, and they created a language in Salamanca, the first Castilian in the Castilian language, which was the first dictionary of the Castilian language, all of which were the prelude or the necessary tools for their expanding empire. But everybody else seems to think it's either the nation state began with the American Revolution. The United States was the first nation state, but France was a much more powerful one. Or some yourself, you argue that it's the real nation state began in the 19th century. So, can you just tell us more about this
Well,
birth of the nation state?
one thing is clear from your question and also from the way you phrased it is that there's no clear answer, right? I mean, this is a language that oscillates around these notions that of nation and state, and the two things being either one and the same. Some people like Hegel, for instance, talks exclusively about the state, and that the nation is just a nominal conception that is, in a sense, eradicated by the state. Then you think about talking in the way that you were talking about the nation. You could say, yes, there was a Spanish nation, as there was an English nation, perhaps slightly later, as there was a French nation much, much later. If you think of these as conglomerates of peoples that nominally at one level share a common heritage, a common language, a common religion, occupy a common geographical space, and so on, but what they don't possess is political coherence. And this is true of Spain. You think Spain often presented itself, or was presented, certainly been presented by historians, as one of the first sort of modern nations within Europe, if you think of those in terms of what will become the Westphalian system after 1648. That would be a reasonable thing to say. I mean, certainly so more coherent than the French, where you have a monarchy and who rules nominally over a large number of independent and semi-independent petit patries, as they call them. But then, of course, you could say that the same is true of Spain, where you have a monarch who rules over a lot of what they call patrias chicas. So these small patria, these small nations that go from being from duchies to bishoprics to simply parishes, for whom there is a coherent organization that then fits into a larger organization and then to a yet larger organization, which is the monarchy itself. And the monarchy itself, for most people, is probably extremely remote and insignificant in a sense. Now, it's true that there's in the Spanish, the self-presentation of the Spanish imperium as it develops from the 16th, 15th century onwards, there is this coherence, which of course is cemented in 1492 with these three great, great is probably the wrong way of putting it, but these three acts, the expulsion of the Jews, the conquest of the last Muslim kingdom, and the dispatching of Columbus to the New World, which then begins to create the Atlantic Empire. So we could say that. But what I was trying to get at in the book, and what I think is probably from the point of view of the modern society more significant, is in fact this idea that all of these bits and pieces that made up the nation now have to be coherently organized into something called the state. And when what Hegel does with this is to say, right, it doesn't do this, but I mean, because it doesn't sit it down, because the language he uses is quite different, but because the word nation doesn't actually appear very often. But there's the idea that the state is a sort of a kind of body that absorbs all of these smaller pieces, all of these smaller entities, which are essentially cultural or ethnic, and at the same time absorbs it into a large political order to which the individual is bound. And so the state then becomes a kind of metaphysical being, or what Emile Durkheim will call a mystic idea, later on. So I think that, and that's why I place it in the 19th century, which is not a novelty by any means, that particularly after the end of the Revolutionary Wars and the Revolutionary Wars and then the Napoleonic Wars. So the following in the wake of the French Revolution, which was of course quite explicitly an attempt to create a nation state, and they don't use that language, but I mean that's the point, that to create a people bound by a constitution, which will bring all of these entities which make up France together, and will make them into one nation, which will also be a state, which will also be controlled, and the people will govern that state. And yes, there might be differences between Gascony and Normandy, but these differences are merely cultural ones. They're not actually political ones. So after that idea gets hold of a whole, these nations throughout Europe. And the example I took there was Italy, and so that you take Italy, which is a very fragmented region of Europe, that has, a lot that binds it together culturally, but nothing that binds it together politically and gives it a political identity. So that is what I see of the significance of the modern nation state, that you can't, as it were, the modern nation state depends very crucially upon having the state at the core of it, whereas the previous entities did not.
Yeah, I was reading very quickly through the new book by Eric Storm, Nationalism, and he does mention that in his argument, the initial nation state of the United States, they were established as a political project. They were political as a result of political disputes. It's not about a unified cultural project, or to unify a culture, or it's not about an ethnos, a unified ethnos, but it's more about a political dispute. The same thing, more or less, with the French Revolution. But perhaps in the 19th century, the nation state, the cultural element became much stronger in the establishment of a nation state. Is that my?
Well, probably. But then, if you take it from the American point of view, one of the things is that you have a nation state. And it's called the United States, which in many ways is strange because it might well have been called the United Nations. It made yes. Which in fact at that time, as far as anything is at all significant, all the peoples belonged to a single ethnos and a single culture and shared a single religion. There were a few Catholics here and there in places like Maryland and so on, but basically there was no. The indigenous peoples didn't count. There were no later immigrants as there had been subsequently. And this, of course, is one of the problems that the United States has faced ever since, that this was brought together as a federation of peoples that were never thought that there would be a cultural split between them, ever. They were all, good Englishmen, basically, a few Scots, and that was it. And it's out of that that this entity is built. And that what holds it together is the state at the center of it. And this distinction didn't really apply at that stage. And then later on, what happens, of course, is because of massive immigration. Then immigration first from Europe, and then from Southern America, and then from parts of Asia, the picture changes dramatically, and this immigration, of course, is dispersed across, and of course, after, don't forget, also the other aspect is the invasion, so to say, westward. So you get a completely different country. By the end of the Civil War, you have a different country from what you had at the end of the War of Independence, and therefore you get this conflict between nation and state. And it's interesting that the Americans, the sort of common language in the United States is always to talk about the nation, right? The nation, as it was in France, of course, also nation, la grande nation, the nation unie. This is the idea that you bring all these things together and you give it a state. But in fact, what holds the United States together is the state, not the nation.
Yes.
And because there is insofar as there's a sort of coherence in the United States at all, it's still that tiny fragment that remains of the first settlers, and then you have all these other what they call and the significance of this language is important, communities, right? I mean, there's the language of community in the United States is very, very strong. I belong to my community. It's just it almost translates out this idea of petit patrie. I belong to this little entity within a larger entity, and that's what. And the number of students I have who say, I've got to give back to my community, I can't go and take a job on the East Coast because I've got to belong to my community. This is particularly true, of course, of African Americans, but by no means only they. So and as you know, we don't need to be told after the last election or anything else, it's an extremely fragmented nation. And I once, many years ago, gave a lecture, part of a conference held at the Library of Congress, and said that I thought the United States didn't have a nation, actually. It has a state. There's a state, but there's no nation. There are all these different communities and nations. It didn't go down very well at the time. But I think that now it's become much more clear that there's no coherent North American nation. There are lots of North American communities that are bound together by a series of constitutional arrangements of one sort or another that make up the United States.
That's wonderfully said. I many decades ago, I was teaching a course in New York, and I asked my students about what they had in common. And it was at Syracuse University, as Americans, what they had in common. A student raised his hand and said, television.
Yes, it's okay. Yes, that's true. They may have that in common, but now they share that with the rest of the world. So it's a bit more. That makes it.
If I understand this correctly, it is the state that creates a nation, and not the nation a state.
Well. In the modern world, you could probably say that is the case. I think that that this phrase that probably was never uttered about D'Azeglio. Now we've made the nation. Now we have to make the Italian nation. Now we have to make the Italians. That would be the same. We've made the Italian state. Now we have to make the Italian nation. But it's, again, as your first question suggested, it's immensely complicated. And it's very different from places to places. There are places, for instance, as I mentioned in the book, there are places in Africa which are simply states. They're nothing else. They're artificial political creations, and the nations that make them up, or the tribes, if you'd like to use that word, which I suppose is because they're kin groups, so rather than actual cultural groups, spread across different contiguous states. So you'll find, and the same is true of lots of people like the Kurds, for instance, to this day. You have people who belong to what one might call there's a Kurdish nation, but there's no Kurdish state. So they live in different states. And this is true of, it's also true to a certain extent in places people like the Scots or the Catalans and so on. So I think that they're very tricky terms to pin down. Okay? But I think if you stand back far enough, you can say there's a general distinction between between what makes up the ethnos of the people, which is a multiplicity of things, and what makes up the sort of political and administrative order that governs those people. And the thing about the modern state is an assumption, which there never really was, not never was, but there was much less in the past, that the two have to go together, that you can't have a people without a state and you can't have a state essentially without people. And the states that exist without peoples, which are some of these places in Africa, which are the remnants of the old imperial order, imperial administrative orders, or Iraq, for instance, don't have that coherence. They have a government, but they don't have a coherence. And this is wrong.
Yeah. And in your book, you talk about the Ottoman Empire occasionally, and how these empires that preceded the establishment of nation states had a much more fluid and probably a better arrangement for the people who lived within the bounds of this empire. which were very fluid. It's And yet these empires. I mean, I'm going to use an anecdote, my own personal story. When I was in Turkey many years ago in 2005, I was given a lecture, and I, inadvertently talked about Ottoman imperialism. And the audience, and my buddies, my colleagues were shocked to hear the term imperialism associated with the Ottomans. And they said, "What do you mean by that?" I said, "Well, I said, no, that's not imperialism. Those are futuhats in Arabic openings.
Right.
Because when you're converting, when you're
Yeah.
spreading Islam,
Yeah.
that's not considered imperialism." But and so I wondered whether whether empires also needed expansions and wars to maintain some semblance or some sense of unity within their realm, or is it more, because that's more closely associated with nation states, as you mentioned in some cases. Some authors and philosophers talk about the necessity of war, of establishing a national identity.
Yeah. Yeah.
But didn't empires do the same thing, or were empires slightly different?
Oh, again, an empire is another word that doesn't sort of easily admit to definition. There are empires. First of all, there are colonial settler empires like the ones in the 19th century, which are very different from the kind of thing that the Ottomans or the British Empire was in India, or the the Spanish Empire was. Well, I suppose the Empire in America is slightly different too, but or particularly the ones within Europe, the Spanish Empire in Europe, for instance, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. All of these, were communities of diverse peoples that, where the government was one that provided a sort of network of security and possibly even prosperity in some occasions, which allowed for a great deal of diversity within their midst. And this was what this kind of model has been used, and it's been described as something. There's a quite celebrated book called the Europe as an Empire. That the idea that the European Union is in fact an empire in this sense. There's a similarity between. This is what I was arguing in the book, between federations and empires. Put it that way. And the Ottoman, and again, there's no clear definition. I don't think the fact that the Ottomans spread Islam, makes them different from the fact that the Spanish are spreading Christianity. If you happen to believe that one is true and the other false, then ideologically that might be the case. But if you believe that both of them are false, then this is simply an excuse. I think and I don't also associate the Ottomans with sort of a degree of evangelism that in the same way that the Spanish were. So the way in which that the Ottoman Empire operated in certain areas, even in certain areas of Europe, for instance, but certainly in certain areas of Asia, meant that those people were probably, we can't make a comparison, living in a more coherent and settled way without having restrictions than they would have been if they'd been nation states. Because if they had been nation states, they would all certainly have been at war with one another. So the ways in which the Ottoman imperial system allowed for a vast range of different peoples to operate within. So you get, Spanish Jews operating in the highest ranks of the Sultanate and so on. It allows for a great deal more flexibility than the nation state, where none of that is possible. Because apart from anything else, within an empire, citizenship is a great idea if you happen to be a citizen. But if you live in a place and you're not a citizen, then it can be a great disadvantage. So, an empire which doesn't have this notion of citizenship, right? It's simply an administrative order to which in some sense you belong. You could say that there's this. That when the one exception would be Rome, but that Rome makes everybody into a citizen. Right? Everybody sitting there as a citizen, which was actually a movement to increase the tax bases rather than anything else. But the idea that you can have this order, legal order, so to speak, legal and administrative order, which binds these various different parts together in a way that provides for security and stability, and also prevents ethnic communities from murdering each other. Because if you think how much better, under most systems, at least that the stability was such that it allowed for less conflict within empires than it existed outside it. But again, not all, because you take the European incursions into Africa, which is often by post-colonialists and anti-imperialists of one sort or another, is usually taken as example. None of that was true. I mean, these people, they were there to exploit, and they were to exploit resources. And they brought this idea that in order to improve the exploitation of resources, they would, to a certain extent, improve, as far as they were able, the living conditions and the status and the security of the peoples that were producing these resources for them. But that was on a very limited. The idea of indirect rule meant that effectively you extracted, but you gave nothing back. And that's a very different notion from what the earlier imperial constructions that go back to antiquity, that include the Ottomans, and in fact the Spanish Empire, not so much in America, but Spanish Empire in Europe in particular, as a sort of model of a mega state, which transforms itself, doesn't always, into some sort of imperial, some sort of confederal arrangement, whereby you have, again, the micro units are brought together in a way which cohere with one another, but are not. But there's still a sort of larger, overarching structure of government and a political structure which allows them to coordinate with one another in such a way that they don't destroy each other. So you don't have the Hegelian prospect of small states all bitterly fighting each other in order to stay alive.
You talk about the European Union as the only really existing federation that's currently, but I read with a tremendous amount of interest Boris Johnson's book on the Dream of Rome, and what fascinated me about his thesis is that the Roman Empire was much more successful in bringing people together and making citizens of European. Everybody aspired to become of the Roman Empire, a citizen of the Roman Empire. And it's a huge difference between that and the bureaucracy in Brussels that try to regulate all kinds of little things. And so what fascinated me is even though, I mean, you probably disagree with him that he championed the notion of Brexit, but he did it on the premise that the Roman Empire was much more successful in creating a unified concept of citizenship than the European Union is.
Well, I mean, yes, I would generally agree with that principle, but then they're very, very different structures. I mean, very different, incomparable. First of all, I mean, what you had with the Roman was a society which was incomparably more sophisticated and advanced than any of the areas over which it eventually ruled. And so what it brought to them was a level of technological advancement, a level of culture and so on that could be nothing of benefit. There's Theodoric the Goth, the man who destroyed Rome, said, every Goth wants to be a Roman. Only the stupidest Roman want to be a Goth. The whole point is that the reason why Rome was destroyed, looks. I mean, there's this analogy that's been made with by the present Italian government, unfortunately, with regard to immigrants from Asia, from the Middle East and from Africa. The reason why Rome was destroyed was because it tried to prevent these tribes from settling in Roman territory, acquiring Roman citizenship, building Roman walls and living in Roman houses like Romans. They said, right, we've had enough of this, very crudely. And so a limit was put on it, and the people who were expelled then came and said, oh, we'll take it over. And in taking it over, of course, they destroyed the whole thing. But, Europe is a conglomeration of nation states, which already existed before, whereas what you had in the Roman world was a nation. And something looked actually under the Republic very much like a modern nation state. In fact, the closest thing I can think of before the 19th century to a nation state under the Republic. It changes a lot with the incoming of the Principate. But and then you had this, pitched against a Europe composed of wandering tribesmen of one sort or another. So the distinctions are very, very, very different. There's no real analogy between it. It's not an excuse for Brexit by any means. There simply is no. There is no analogy whatsoever between these two. I mean, it's true that Rome has become a model, and you can see in all sorts of ways. I mean, the Roman Empire is a model because the Roman Empire is an empire which, in this has its spreads over the world. As I think it was James Wilson made this remark, founders of the United States, that it wasn't Rome that spread itself over the world; it was the world that came to Rome. And this, in a sense, was what poured itself over the Romans, that expression he uses. But so the idea that somehow this was a way of bringing peoples together, which brought them into the Roman world, to the extent that the patrician societies become the thing. The last Roman empires weren't Roman. The last few, I think 3 Roman emperors never set foot in Rome. It becomes but it's unique. I can't think of any other imperial system that's like that. This idea of having a nominal capital, which is more theoretical than it is or real, imaginary than it is real. And of course, the question of citizenship is always very complicated, because the Edict of Caracalla of 212, which made everybody under a Roman rule, that's to say everybody within the space that was called the Imperium Romanum, became a citizen, didn't really carry with it much emphasis. It sounds very good when you look at it. Most of the peoples who were previously living under their own separate legislation, paying their own separate taxes, are much happier being like that than they were being Roman citizens as such. So, this idea of a unity, that Rome brought its unity, is something of an illusion. But on the other hand, it is certainly true that, as I say, this has always been the model, and there's a way in which you can think about it as being the model. This was a society which transformed these peoples over a very long period of time, of course, and it transformed them for the better, and it improved their lives immensely. When the Roman Empire in the West collapsed, the societies that inherited it were, went to pieces for 300-400 years before they could recover themselves again. Not so much in the East, it's true, but so I think there's nothing quite like that, and that succeeds it. And in a way, it's a different model, because the model I'm talking about is one where, much more likely, where the states involved are already on a par with one another. There might be some discrepancy between them, but that they does have one thing in common with Rome, however, and this goes back to the crucial point of the book, is that it's a legal order, and that the Roman law becomes the law of Europe, and still is in great areas the Roman law, the law of Europe. And whereas you have this legal apparatus which governs the relationships between peoples, both the jus civile and the jus gentium, between these various peoples, and at the same time there are spaces beneath that for micro communities to have their own rules, their own regulations, and of course the other thing about the Roman Empire is it never tried to impose, even under its Christian rule, is very much a form of religious uniformity. So you don't get that form of conflict between peoples. Certainly under the Republic, it never did.
Yeah, I mean, as you speak, again, I keep thinking about you provoke all kinds of questions and thoughts. One of them, as you're speaking, for some reason, I thought of Bernard Lewis, the late Orientalist and historian.
Yes.
And it reminds me, he has a book called The Political Language of Islam. And in that book, he talks about a whole bunch of concepts like independence, nation, that didn't exist like 200 years before. So they adopted directly from the language of the nation state in Europe, and so this terminology, this vocabulary now has shaped people's consciousness in the last century or the last so on and so forth, and everybody is taking it as natural and take it for granted, and so the nation state. You do talk about the Enlightenment brought us a notion of civilization, and perhaps other notions of the human sciences, and with the nation state we got a lot of academic subjects like history, national literatures, and archaeology, anthropology, museums, and all of that, which kind of bolstered the notion of a nation. Things that did not exist in the age of, I think, of the empire or the sultanate. I remember, I think, a historian, I think it may be Abdullah al-Arwi, the great Moroccan historian, who in one of his works talked about the fact that a Moroccan, somebody born in Morocco in the 19th century, for example, or even the earlier 20th century, would spend an entire life without ever getting in contact with the government. Well, an official of the government. I mean, they just never met the government or an official representing the government, which is why the notion of human rights became important in the modern era, because the governments, actually the state, became way more powerful, more present in people's lives. And so would you say that's one of the effects of the establishment of the nation state is the people who lived in the villages or the countryside or maybe even small towns, who spent an entire life never meeting an official of the government, never all of a sudden realizing that the state is much closer to them than it had ever been before.
Yes, I think that's probably part of the story. I mean, I think that, and of course, with modern communications, it's impossible to avoid the state. It's true what you're saying, even in the middle, say, the early part of the 19th century or the end of the 18th century, it would be possible to live in a community in the Dordogne or in some part of southern Italy, for instance, and never realize that there was a state anywhere. I mean, what you know is the local mayor or the local whatever who it was,
Yes.
your point of contact, and then of course, as I said, in much earlier periods before the sort of formation of the state, your loyalty would be to your local seigneur, your local feudal overlord, and only remotely beyond that to anything larger. And that now is an impossibility, obviously. It's still true, I think, that in a lot of regional areas, probably even in Europe, and beyond Europe, certainly the case that being in contact with the local is more important than the general. And you see the ways that elections run, for instance, that elections tend to be focused, local elections tend to focus on a far different range of things than national elections. And you often get different parties same people will vote for one party for a national election and it's a completely different party for a local one. But I think that nevertheless, the difference between the local and the national has become much more fused than it was. The other aspect of it, of course, is something that brought in this celebrated book by Benedict Anderson. We talked about imagined communities. The idea that what the state, the nation state, is an imagined community, because up until the advent, he focuses this on the beginning of the 19th century, because the advent of newspapers, and then of course eventually telephones, telegraphs, and all of these developments in the 19th century certainly escalated this idea of a single community, which was much larger than the village, and or the petit patrie or the patra chica, or whatever it happens to be. And so that then becomes, and I can say, oh, I'm English, or I'm German, or I'm French, well, actually, never having actually had any real understanding of what the French or the German or the English might be at the far end of the country, in which I'm calling England, Germany, and France. Okay, so let alone if you start thinking places like India, right? What you call India, which is after all a nation state, or even China for that matter. So I think that aspect of it is certainly very important. That the person now is inescapably attached to the state. There's no way they can escape from it. Even if it, and of course democracy enhances that incredibly, because even if you're voting and you have no idea who you're voting for or why you're voting, which clearly the case in the United States most often than not, nevertheless you're voting, and that act itself is something, and the extraordinary extent to which elections are public events gives a sense of coherence to the nation that it would never have had before that. it could never have had before that. So, national elections, it seems to me, this is why I always say, you can't have possibly have a democracy without a nation. So a nation state without a democracy, but you can't really have a democracy without a nation state, because the thing of bringing people together in this semi-ceremonial way, that which elections, which start off. And this is another thing, is actually something that the founding fathers of the United States, sort of Hamilton, talks about this, that one function of election is to elect people, right? That's an important function. But the secondary function of elections is a ritual one that then brings you all together to say, we belong to this community that is an electoral community. And that's very, very clear now, much more so than it was when Hamilton was writing, but anywhere in the world where elections are held, that they really emphasize that this is, even if it's only for a very short period of time and then it stops, but that this is what the nation or the state consists of.
I keep wondering whether the Patria Chica has dissolved into the Patria Grande but then when I look at the history of Spain, ever since the Catholic monarchs in the late 15th century, Spain has really never been unified. It was a failed unification project.
Yes, except you said it really wasn't. What happens in Spain, it wasn't a unification project then. I mean, it was, yes, in its sense, it was to bring Aragon and Castile together in this marriage union. But then after all, marriage unions were doing that. Well, that's what marriage unions are for. So you're constantly building these larger entities. And that famous remark about the Austrians, you Austria happy through marriage. The Austria was created, the Austro-Hungarian was created entirely by dynastic connections. So that is true, and I think that this union, the union that was attempted, the union of arms that was called under Olivares in the 17th century, was really an attempt to make good what was being claimed about what existed before. But don't forget, the official language of Aragonese, despite the use of Castilian, which you mentioned, and of course it goes back to the Siete Partidas of a much earlier generation of using Castilian in Castile anyway, rather than Latin. So the idea of the vernacular, meaning that the laws could be cast in the vernacular in such a way that they'd be, intelligible to far and written down to. I got a copy of them back here somewhere. To a far greater large number of people than had previously been the case. That these acts were ones that then would attempt to impose a common language upon the whole of the Iberian Peninsula, was never very successful. And it's one of the things that remained in Catalonia, for instance, until 1700. So what the Catalans refer to as the Bourbon invasion of 1700, that after the Spanish War of Succession, and then they start imposing this language on Catalan, but it's never been successful. I mean, now they've got this backlash whereby you can't really get a job unless you can't get a job in university unless you publish books in Catalan. But I mean, there's that aspect of it, and as when. With Franco, it's interesting. The Franco dictatorship. One of the things about it was precisely again to try and create this thing. España unida. This is one currency. Well, that was always had, of course, but one leadership, one religion, one nation. This was the thing, and the demise, the collapse of that regime has led to a greater fragmentation than existed before. Now you have a state which, the last king, now in exile, of course, said, Spain is a federation. I mean, in desperation, it wasn't being fragmented. But it's not true, but in a sense, it's not literally true. But if you think of what it's now it's more disunited than say Great Britain is, and that's saying a lot. So I think that these entities are very, in a sense, unless they're very small, they're very unstable. In the modern world, most of these European nations that were created, all of them have. France probably is the sole serious exception. Now there are lots of minor areas that are in conflict with one another, but and lots of regional nationalisms involving language. There's nothing like there is in Spain, and of course in Italy. Italy's as well, this possibility, always this possibility, may go back to this fragmentation between North and South and so on.
Your book led me to think about the notion of political citizenship, and which I am a Moroccan American. I'm a U.S. citizen, and I'm as well as Moroccan. But for some reason, I spent most of my life in the United States, but I am just much closer culturally and emotionally to Morocco, because so it led me to think if there's a difference between the notion of citizenship, which seems a kind of like a practical transactional relationship, so to speak, with a state, with a community, as opposed to something much deeper, which is a cultural community, a place uh, where you were born and raised and developed very thick ties with the community. And so I know that the nation state, the notion of citizenship, takes precedence in a nation state. But do you see any kind of, is that a reason why, let's say, the Patriot Grande in Spain has never been successful? Or is it because, or maybe even in the United Kingdom now, there's still like some tensions here and there about independence and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, citizenship is a curious notion. I think it's a legal. I mean, it's a legal definition. I think. I mean, I'm in a similar position to you, but that in having two citizens, at least two different
Yes.
passports. But I mean, the thing is that you don't. It doesn't carry with it. Certainly, doesn't carry with it in the modern sense of the word, where it becomes something that you can shift from one to the other without. You do it for reasons of employment or whatever. You don't do it as a matter of conviction.
Yes.
So I think that it's a legal thing. It's a very important legal thing. It holds the state together in that sense, and it might confer upon you, and certainly I think confers upon Julie and I, both nationalized Americans, and confers upon both of us a sense of sort of political responsibility. That's to say that you would go, which doesn't go much beyond voting. It's true, but nevertheless, you do feel that you have an obligation to vote. You feel you have to participate in it to that extent. But it certainly doesn't come with any sort of cultural attachment of any sort. And I think that would be. I can't see how that would be the case with. I mean, America is a very strange situation because you wouldn't know what you were attaching yourself to, as I said, because it's so immensely diverse in that respect. So it's not what is it to be an American, no idea whatsoever. But even if you were to become German or French or something, in that, for those particular reasons, you would, I'm still thinking on my feet here. It's a bit difficult to know what would be the case. I mean, Julia, for instance, has never become a French citizen, but then in all respects, she's very much attached to France, and so she has a kind of cultural citizenship, which is French. I might say it's something slightly the same for me, but so we feel attachment to the place, we feel a comfort, we feel a sort of. But not obviously at every level, because you've got to be critical as well. But I don't. I really think look upon citizenship as being just a political and legal concept that carries nothing with it, except, and it's it has acquired this language of something slightly more, and it's not. I don't think it's instant that it's acquired this language first in the context, I think, of the French Revolution, where being a citoyen made you an entity with an established set of rights, because if you remember, the significant point about the rights of man is it's the rights of man and citizen. You can't have those rights unless you're a citizen. And so that linkage is very significant. So it gave you a status as an individual within the state and within the nation at the same time. So that's that conception of it one can see, but for the most parts, in the sort of modern cosmopolitan world, which we all inhabit, not all of us perhaps, but most of us do, then that would, I think it's a legal thing that carries with it legal obligations and legal benefits, of course, and enormous legal benefits, but there's no necessary any corresponding cultural attachment that might go with it. I mean, cultural attachments always seem to me, particularly in the modern world, to be very tenuous anyway. I don't know. I mean, what when you say you feel more at home in Morocco, I know what you mean. I've seen you in Morocco, after all. I haven't seen the United States, it's true. So it's in confines of the university.
Yeah.
But, I can see that you're very much at home. And I,
Well,
I know
this
that
brings,
I'm familiar to with it, but what significance?
this brings me back to the relationship between state and nation. I think the United States, we talked about, it's a powerful state, and yet it has failed to create a proper nation. When people ask me when I travel, I'm sure you get the same questions. How is the United States? How is life in the United States, and so on and so forth. Because everybody knows the United States. Most people know more about the United States than I do because of the news and
Yeah,
the movies and everything else. And I say, well, it's an economic power. It's a military and economic power, but it's probably in some ways a failed nation. It has not. You can find very very powerful nations in Africa and Asia and some other places, but failed states.
yeah.
And so
It's a nice.
it's so I mean it's very. I mean, does it make a little bit
Yeah,
some sense to
it does.
you?
I mean, I think failed nation is probably right in the sense that if that was ever the project, I mean, that's the point, because failure suggests that you set out to do something. Then the Americans, I mean, is often talk about, as I say, the general language is that of the nation, and rather than the state. But in fact, I think the state exists, very real. It's very efficient. It's very powerful. It's not always doesn't always behave as it should do, but still, it's very powerful. It's very efficient, and I'm a great admiration for it in many ways. But it doesn't. It isn't the same thing as the state, and it doesn't. It isn't created by the nations. It says nations, and it hasn't created a nation. Whether that has ever been the intention, because what the, as I say, the founders set out to create was a state that would work in the place of Britain. But it never occurred to them that they would need something to go with that we might now call because what you didn't have in 1789 or 1776 was these massive migrations. You have a situation, if you look at the United States, very similar to what I think a lot of people in certain parts of Europe, Italy, for instance, being perhaps at the moment in the forefront of it, and France talks about a lot, the famous replacement, that we're going to have all these immigrants are going to flood into France and they're going to flood into Italy. And before long, the whole thing of what was France and what was Italy is going to disappear. It's going to be replaced by some hybrid thing created by it's not going to be, the replacement is, it's of course a gross exaggeration. But it's not going to simply replace the French, but it's going to replace French or Italian culture as it's currently understood, if those exist. But anyway, by something that'll be a hybrid. Now, and since these people are, I was listening to a discussion the other day about population decline. Since these people are expanding and the Western Europeans are declining in population, their populations will eventually take over and so on. So this is, I'm sure you're aware of this, is somewhat hysterical model of the future and so on. So, but the point is that when you think about this, not unlike what happened in the United States. And in fact, you had this, it's not a remplacement completely, but if you think that what the founders thought of as Americans, incidentally, what they called Native Americans, were English, and those people are now very much in the minority. And Huntington wrote this book. Samuel Huntington is famous for this book, but actually wrote a much more sinister book later than that, which was making this argument against, basically against Hispanics, because people from Spanish America, because he said there is going to be, this is the same sort of argument you get from the extreme right in France and Italy, that there's going to be a great replacement. But it'll be a Hispanic replacement. It's not. He was bewailing it. I'm not sure that one should bewail it, but it's not entirely untrue. If you think of in California, the percentage of Americans of Hispanics is now greater than that of whites. So it's not quite clear what whites come. But whites itself includes a vast variety of different people. What there isn't in places like California on the East Coast, in particular, or even in the West, is anything that resembles a coherent ethnic identity of the kind that used to exist on the East. So, and also these are peoples who have different religious backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, and they try to preserve as far as possible a lot of what they didn't come and say, well, forget the past, we're going to become Americans. They become Americans, but they bring their national identities, or their national in that sense identities, with them.
Yes, and who we are. I mean, I think there's just there's an argument that the reason the United States, maybe and Canada as well, have been successful is because they've been populated or run or managed by Anglo-Saxons, as opposed to the Latins in the rest of the Americas who have failed to develop economies and so on and so forth. So it's an old argument, right? I mean, so is that an anxiety about the diminishing control of the Anglo-Saxon element in American society, or is it?
I think I don't know how many people would acknowledge it, or be prepared to say so in public. But I mean, other than Samuel Huntington, but the argument of the book was that, yes. I mean, I think it starts off with this premise that the South failed. The South always fails. The south of Italy failed. South of Spain failed. South of Spain is Andalusia. The south of Italy is Sicily. The south of the Americas is Mexico, and all the way down to Chile and so on. And that this is all. I mean, if you don't think in simple geographical terms, determinist geographical, this has got to do with some sort of Latinate thing that doesn't, might be beautifully imaginative, but it isn't very good at economics and power and so on and so forth. This seems to be a lot of hogwash. I mean, basically, I don't think the Americas. I think you can find good reasons why the states of Latin America never became coherent in the same way that the states of North America became coherent. That has a lot to do with the history of the development of these places. And it is true, there were a great deal of lost opportunities in the 19th century in Spanish America, which might have resulted in something very, very different. If Bolivar's amphitryotic federation, as I say in the book, had gone ahead, we might be looking at a very, very different Spanish American one we look at today. But I think, what I don't think is it's got anything to do with sort of the South-North, this is bubbling, energetic South as goes to the cool, calm, balanced Anglo-Saxon North. There's a bit of that. I haven't read this book of Huntington's.
Yes.
But from cover to cover, but there's a certain amount of that implied, that there's. And you sometimes come across American exceptionists who always make this same claim, that America is exceptional because it took the sort of most determined, effective, not imaginative, but determined and effective part of British culture, namely the most extreme form of Protestantism, and transplanted it and sort of transplanted it and made a new plant out of it. And that plant has come to dominate the world. I mean, it's a historical fantasy.
I've always told my Spanish friends that they make very bad imperialists. They haven't been successful as an empire because they're passionate. They're not well organized. They're not like the cool-headed Northern Europeans who know how to proceed with their business and so on. And also, I tell my friends that, the natural go-between between the world of Islam and the West is Spain. Spain, there's no other country in the world like Spain in terms of who can connect between the two civilizations, which can connect between the two civilizations and the two cultures. 800 years of history, great Islamic monuments, and yet they have never been able to have that special and unique place among Arab and Muslim nations. It's very interesting. It puzzles me.
Well, it's part of the anti-Islamic crusade, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can't expect them to. The whole image of Spain from the 15th century onwards, except for this period in the 19th century where you try to get the question of convivencia and so on, to revive the idea of Spain being a middle line between the two, which is certain, lots of Spanish today would want that. I remember lots of discussions, to hear them recently about of the way when Spain joined the Union in 92, there was a lot of debate about how the Union should now go south, cross into, and so it's Tangier, Morocco, these places should now be brought into the European Union. So we should think about Europe as having flexible boundaries and not just eastward, where the sort of language makes more sense in a sense. But what makes a Hungarian, Ottoman who lived most of their lives under Ottoman rule, and before that under Russian rule, what makes them more European than, say, a Moroccan? Right. So nothing. So we can think about the borders of the Mediterranean. We can think of Europe as being defined by the old Roman world, rather than geographically, rather than defined in a sort of by the sort of essentially by its religious components. So there was a lot of talk about that. I remember in the end of the late 90s. It seems to have dropped away now. But that would have been, in a sense, making Spain into a kind of bridging gap.
Well, if tourism is a big component now of establishing a national identity or imagined national identities, I mean, some of the most popular tourist destinations in Spain are Islamic monuments, Granada and Sevilla and Cordoba.
Having seen lots of tourists, I'm not this thing about national character, images is a wonderful exchange between the ambassadors of Spain and Madrid and London in the late 17th century, and the one from the British ambassador or English ambassador was to London is saying, I can't understand these people. They all dress in black. They never leave their houses. They're very quietly spoken, and so on. And then you get the Spanish ambassador from London writing back to them and saying, don't understand people. They're always shouting and yelling. They spend a lot of time on the streets, always having fiestas, parties. They dress in bright colours. And so, these things change over time too. So,
one last question. Capitalism. I mean, I was really struck by, beginning from Adam Smith all the way to John Maynard Keynes, there was this attempt, they always imagined a future without the crass, grubby entrepreneur, and then our grandchildren or great grandchildren will have a much better world where in which they won't have to deal with these types of people. But that's never happened. We keep waiting for that time to happen, but it's never happened. And not many years ago, I read a piece. I think it's in the Wall Street Journal or someplace. The reason between John Maynard Keynes's letter to his grandchildren and now there were new products have been introduced to the market, whether it's an iPhone, whether it's something else. So even though technology has created some sort of abundance. And yet people are continue to struggle to pay the bills. They have never been able to find that kind of space, that environment where they're beyond a life of necessities. So what role does capitalism play in delaying your wonderful, I'm not going to call it utopian project of a federation of federations or a world beyond the nation state?
It's not a utopia in the sense that it's not... yes, I suppose it depends on what you think of utopia as being. It's a sort of model that one can think about as an alternative that might help one think more clearly about what the options are. I'll put it that way. So it's much more sort of Kantian thought experiment than anything else. But I think that capitalism as such is something that I can't imagine the world of the kind that I tried to describe as a possibility existing in anything other than a capitalist environment. Because the alternatives that we've tried have been such disastrous failures. So it doesn't mean I'm not a prophet. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be something like that in the future. I think that the trouble is, as you say, the grubby merchant. As there's this text in the 18th century, I'm not sure if I quoted the book by a man called Dubuisson, who says one should never first confuse commerce with the commerçant. The commerçant is this, he's an instrument We need him, but otherwise it's not going to work. Somebody's got to do out and do the negotiating. But what commerce does is bring people together, make them, force them into relationships with each other, which they would never have otherwise, and which are not necessarily antagonistic ones. Because the only other thing that forces people together is warfare, and that doesn't ends up by destroying both parties. So this is the one. This is the most common. So how do you get to a society which the only way to do that, I would suggest, is precisely by having a greater set of controls, which brings me back to a set of controls from the political order of whatever shape that's to take. To mention something you said earlier with, I think, regard to Boris Johnson, that the image of the European Union, for instance, as being an agent is much treasured by the British, I should say, in building this false image in order to sell it to the British public during the referendum of the union being concerned exclusively with fiddling details of bureaucratic nonsense. If you look at it, I mean, it's an interesting fact that the Commission, which after all governs the economic affairs of a large number of nation states, and not just those states within Europe, but also beyond Europe as well, employs less people in the state of California than the University of California does. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, in terms of the actual numbers of people involved, it's a fantasy. There's this idea that the English always perpetrated this huge bureaucracy. The other thing is that this, more importantly, is this regulations are an crucial aspect of trying to keep these institutions in line, because you have on the one hand, it's this endless problem. You have on the one hand these capitalist institutions which push us forward, which make us rich, which make us profitable, which bring good to us. On the other hand, they're also desperately trying to destroy each other. So and the consequences of which is to undermine the good that they can possibly. They're doing good despite themselves. And one of the things that the EU has done very effectively is to reduce this impact. You think of the effect that the restrictions on Google have had, for instance, on the international market, because as the EU is the second largest market in the world after the United States, no one can afford to, find themselves on the wrong side. The most recent one, which is I don't know about this, is the ways in which Apple, this computer I'm using, has always used dozens of different plugs. So that every time you buy a new computer, you have to buy a new plug. And that now the EU has brought in a ruling which says they can't do this any longer. So you don't have to have, as we have in this, 7 or 8 different plugs depending on what instruments you have. And so these kinds of things, they're very important to keeping the commerçant, as it were, in line, making sure he does the job he's supposed to do without destroying himself and anything else. And there was another sort of comic aspect of this was that one of the things that was used against the EU, actually started before the Brexit campaign, but much used in Britain, was that they spend their time regulating the shape of bananas. And there's an EU breaking on the regulating the shape of bananas. Well, there are 2 facts about that. 3. One, it's true that there is a regulation. 2, that this regulation came in place as a result of a plea from the banana growers of Martinique. Right. So it came through previous colony, through France. And secondly, the shape of bananas determines the quality of them. So, you have a straightforward question of competition here, right? What counts as a banana? And there was another one which was the EU introduced this regulation, which eventually was overruling that the British could not call what they sold as ice cream, because although it was iced, it wasn't cream. So they had to call it ice dairy milk substitute. Yes. These are okay. It's very funny, but these are ways of preventing, the poor people of Britain deceived into this collection of whale fat or whatever it is churned out that they're being offered as ice cream is the same thing as what you buy in your Italian ice cream store.
And I think more and more Americans are becoming more grateful for European Union regulations, because they, in the end, they end up protecting the American consumer in some ways. And
exactly, no, it does. I mean,
yes.
Think of things like the levels of there's this great battle, as going on at the moment about importation of meat from outside Europe, and you think of the levels of pollutants of one sort or another that are available in. I don't eaten meat very much now, but big American steaks that are full of antibiotics of one sort, which are simply not allowed in Europe at all. No, I think there's a way in which the only way to be more serious answer to your question about what do we do about capitalism, what do we do about the damaging effects of globalization, because that's what I was essentially talking about there in that section of the book, is to regulate it, and that's the only thing we can do. And that regulation has to come from some supranational authority. It can't come from the nation state. The Americans aren't going to regulate the activities of Google. It's going to be somebody else. It's got to be an international organization that will do that.
Anthony, I need more conversations with you, and we're going to stop here now. But then I hope you come back and we continue. There's so many other things to discuss, and I know you have a broad range of interests. I can't keep up with your writing, but I'm trying. Thank you so much for this. Thank you so much for joining me.